Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Please be seated. Well, wowie zowie, a lot of good stuff and interesting things in our scriptures today. And as tempting as it is to try once again to make sense of losing my life to gain my life, we get that 3 or 4 or 5 times a year in the gospel, that whole thing about being first and last, losing to gain, and so forth. And that's it. It is one of the paradoxes of the Christian faith that that's a spiritual truth, that things are just that way. But what I'm more interested in is this continuity between the story about Abram and the interpretation of it by Paul. See, the story of Abram is so pivotal to our own modern world. Unbelievably powerful and potent Abram's offspring have become. How dangerous they are to one another. Abram was called out of comfort and a settled city to take up a nomadic life. He moved up north into what modern day Iraq, from down on the lower part of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. He went up north, and then he went down all the way through what we would call Israel today, even probably part of Syria, and down all the way to the Negev Desert in the southern end of modern Israel, and then once to Egypt, where he tried to trade Sarah off to the Pharaoh to keep his head on his shoulders. Anyway, so Abram had a long journey. And it's in the midst of this journey that the 3 angels, the 3 strangers, the 3 somethings, 3 spiritual messengers show up in the camp and give him this message. And so the covenant given made no sense. Old man, you're going to be the father of many nations. Old woman, you're finally going to have a baby. And I don't even want to know what words might be said by some of you if you found out you were pregnant right now. Or soon we're going to be. It's it's an extraordinary story. It's a God story, a revelation story. But the importance of it is that Abram became the father of nations because he did really 1 and 2 things. He trusted and he went. He trusted and he went. And it was reckoned to him, Paul says in his interpretation of this story, and in the Jewish interpretation of this story, it is certainly there, that it is reckoned to him as righteousness, his trust. We continually get caught in the trap of thinking that righteousness is necessarily about following a bunch of rules, many of which we're not quite clear on. And that really makes us nervous because we're afraid we're stomping on God's toe and don't know it. Because we're not quite sure what are all the laws. That's why we read the 10 Commandments. They're a pretty good start on loving God and loving your neighbor, loving your spouse, being kind, being gentle, not violent. Do with what you have. Don't be grabbing somebody else's. It's don't have any other gods but me. Right? Same list. Simple stuff. first part, staying in right relationship with God, though, human beings love to complicate that. And we cannot just blame that on first century Jews and the Jewish law, because if you've ever been around prissy Episcopalians, I want to tell you they can have more rules about the liturgy and handling things and white gloves, and I've seen black butlers serving coffee on silver trays in Episcopal churches. So, we can be pretty hoity-toity. We can come up with lots of rules. Lots of it has to be this way. It's supposed to be that way. If you do it wrong, I've known people that, acolytes were in fear of them. And I always thought, why? Why should they be in fear of serving their God? They're not serving you, acolyte master. Not really even serving me. They're helping me serve God. And in doing that, they serve. Everybody up here is supposed to be a servant, but as we get to be up front, people like to have power, and some people like to have control. And so humans promulgate rule after rule after rule, and standard after standard, often to separate themselves from others that they fear. And there we are. Now let's say Abraham is 1800 BC. We're 2017 after that. So we're nearly 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago. A man had an experience of God that has produced first the Jewish people, then the Christians, and then the Muslims. How important has that become in our modern world? Abram, what were you thinking? Well, Abram was thinking, I'll do what God tells me to do, and the outcome's in God's hands. Because it wasn't just that he would have descendants and nations. It was also that he would become a blessing to the nations. The third part of the covenant is that that the faith that he represented would be a blessing to all nations. It was God's covenant started with this, most likely very much a historical figure of some sort. However, sort of in the legendary mists this story comes from, probably a real story about a real person who came to a place of believing in one powerful God. From that God, we believe, was sent Jesus. In the line of Abram, a descendant of Abram, a descendant of David, one of those people who were raised in the midst of the concept that God had picked them out of all the peoples of the world to represent him on earth. That was their highest calling as a people. Jesus Christ came that those who did not know the law, did not know Moses, did not know the temple, didn't know any of it, Paul would say, came to give us a way in that does not require us to figure out all those laws, but rather to go back prior to the law. Abram's way before Moses and the Ten Commandments, hundreds of years before Moses. So Abram's righteousness could not have been based on Jewish law. That's what Paul is saying. His relationship with God, his right relationship with God, couldn't have been based on the law because it didn't exist yet. What was reckoned to him as righteousness was not obeying rules, but trusting God's voice and acting on it when you didn't understand and it doesn't make sense. That's a statement about my career. Often I've been in places saying, what am I doing here? Why did I say yes to this? So the interpretation that Paul puts on this story is, by our time, you see, Abram had, just to fill in the blank, you remember Abram had Sarah's slave was given to him because Sarah couldn't have a baby. So it wasn't unheard of, well, then take one of the servant women and produce an heir with her. That was Hagar. Then Sarah was really jealous when Hagar produced an heir, and she couldn't. And in the end, she had Hagar and her son Ishmael thrown into the desert to die. And an angel comes and saves them. They're spared. And do you know that Muhammad, the original prophet Muhammad, his tribe traced their origins all the way back to Ishmael? So the prophecies of Muhammad start with this Abram. So, but the other side of the story, the other brother. So here we are, for some reason, unable, all putting our faith in the God that Abram introduced to the world, and we cannot seem to find a way on a global scale to live in peace. Because there's always people who need their religion to be a fortress that holds at bay everything they're afraid of in the world out there. And whatever people go on the other side of the wall are not part of my world. And I don't want them to be. They're dangerous. But the truth is, we're all, what was it was it Lincoln, where they asked him if he was praying that God would bless the Union forces and or that God was on his side, and he said, I would much rather it be known that I was on God's side. Is it Lincoln? Have you heard that? Yeah, something. I'm paraphrasing. So it's getting the right thing in order. Faith and trust come. We still have our rubrics, we have our laws, we have a book of canons for the Episcopal Church. It all helps us order our common life, but it isn't God, nor is it divine. It is our agreement about how we're going to live together as a church and how we're going to worship together in an orderly way, so that if I go to another Episcopal church to communion, I know what's going on pretty much. But stylistically may be different, but I know what's going on. Even if I go to Spanish Mass in Mexico, in the Mexican Episcopal Church, I know what's happening. We have a common life. And that requires some common sense, common rules that allow us to live in harmony, the Ten Commandments kind of stuff. But we also need to come to that place where we trust. Not in our rules, not in our ability to follow them, but in God's desire to redeem us. Because God just reckons our trust to us as being the right relationship. You see how righteousness becomes a relationship, not a rule-based world. It is a relationship. When I'm in a good relationship with you, I don't want to act in ways that harm you. It just comes naturally, and I need some training, and I need, some wisdom from elders to tell me where those boundaries are. But we agree on them. What a free world we get to live in. What a free world we get to worship God in, where we can just gather and do it the way that we kind of like to do it, and yet know that every one of us have to lay our trust that God is going to bless what we do. So I reckon that's righteous. I reckon we can sort of righteously trust our way through this Eucharist and through our confessions and through our doings and through our lovings. And in all those things, we're grafted into that branch, that root of Jesse, that line of faith that goes all the way back to Abram's discovery of the one God that we now all worship. I pray for peace among us and our cousins, that someday we will worship God together in peace.